Excellent. So everyone's here for the quick course in React. Okay. So thank you for coming. So the subject of this topic is accessibility in the Accessible Canada Act. How does it apply to Drupal? What does it mean for this community? And what are the things that we need to be doing here to go off and to make sure that this is a way to go off and to help promote Drupal as the Government of Canada becomes more accessible and more inclusive. So, oops, where did that jump? So I'm Mike Gifford. I'm the president of Open Concept Consulting. I'm also a Drupal 8 maintainer. I'm one of 3 accessibility maintainers. Andrew and Rain are doing a great job. In fact, are doing more heavy lifting on the technical side of Drupal accessibility than I am, and I really appreciate their involvement. I also do a lot of work with Aliyao, which is an accessibility community here in Ottawa that does work on I guess the promoting events like Global Accessibility Awareness Day and highlighting, trying to build a community of practice around accessibility in Ottawa. I also was involved in creating a Drupal security guide and contributing to a definitive guide to Drupal 7 ages ago. So a couple questions before we dive into the accessibility stuff. How many people are here from government? Okay, and how many people are here from a crown corporation or federally regulated agency? So a couple of people from there. How many people are here from organizations that serve government? So this is, companies, businesses, volunteers that serve and play a role in supporting government. All right, that's great. So most of you will already know about accessibility, at least from some perspectives. And I wanted to go and give a little bit of an introduction to accessibility first before we dive into the Accessible Canada Act. The WCAG 2.0 guidelines have 4 main principles. And that is that things are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. It's important to try and break that down and to think about that and think about, perceivable. You can think about how this ties to vision, or if you're dealing with somebody who is deaf, trying to go off and make sure that everything is available for them in a readable format or a visual format. Operable, trying to make sure that you can actually use the form. Can you interact with it? Understandable, I think this is a major failing of so many government forums and websites. So much of the time, it's what the heck are they actually saying? What is being asked for in this form? Because it's written by committee and it's written in a way that is, if you're an industry expert, you understand what this is. But if you're not, if you're an average Canadian who's trying to go off and fill in their taxes, for instance, it's baffling. So understandable is another key part of accessibility. The other thing is that it needs to be robust. And particularly for government people, there's an assumption that accessibility is something that if they test it in IE with JAWS, in a Windows environment, that you're good. But that's not very robust. That's intensely fragile that even within the government people have begun to understand. So robust means basically any device, any context, whether it's your iPad at a conference or whether it's in your laptop out on a sunny day, or whether it's in a situation where you're using the screen reader, whether it's NVDA or VoiceOver, you're testing in a broad variety of contexts and places where people are engaging with the technology in different ways. I was actually supposed to change the order on this a bit, but so the bingo. So there's the bingo question. The Drupal Camp bingo. So if you want to thank a presenter, make sure to go off and you can either thank Nerdstein, which is N3RDSDIN, which is our keynote speaker, or M. Gifford, which is much easier to spell, no lead characters, M. Gifford on Twitter. So you can thank me and get your first point on the Drupal Camp bingo. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. I also wanted to go off and look at some of the things that that came from the keynote address as well. So it is interesting to go off and to think how a small group of people can really change the world. I've been spearheading Drupal accessibility now for over a decade. And it has really been interesting to go off and to shift 3% of the web to be more accessible by default. And it's really quite an amazing process. And it certainly wasn't done by me alone. There's a huge opportunity of people like Adam and others who jumped in and went off and were able to help push things ahead. And there are advocates and volunteers and people who really pushed the bar in terms of what's possible, what to imagine in terms of what was doable. And I really do hope that people come back from this and sort of say, well, what can the government do? What can the involvement could be? Could it be involved in the Drupal Association? Could it be sponsoring events like this? Are there ways that they could try and encourage more people to get involved in the community? And with accessibility in particular, there's one blind Italian student who in the year before he started university contributed more to the Drupal 8 core project on accessibility than all of the governments in the world combined. So we can only go up from here, right? If one individual can contribute more to Drupal's accessibility than all of the governments in the world, then Canada can be a real leader in the space by contributing just a little bit. The other thing was talking about Gatsby, and I'm not going to talk about Gatsby here, but I'm really happy that Gatsby is another framework that has made a priority around accessibility. And Gatsby is one of the challenges is that a lot of these frameworks don't prioritize accessibility, don't actually make it something that they're building into their core framework. And that's one of the things that we've done in Drupal, and WordPress was moving in that direction, but then failed with the whole Gutenberg thing. And then it's lovely to go off and to see that there's another big front-end framework that's trying to embrace accessibility and move that forward. So back on accessibility. This is a reference to a Microsoft inclusive design toolkit, and Jutta Travarius was involved in consulting with this. She's the person that went off and helped create the ATAG 2.0 specification, which is the authoring tool accessibility guidelines. Yeah, we often have ways of interacting with the web, which is, we think about people with permanent disabilities. And it's like, well, why should we really worry about those people who are, it's such a small portion of the population that's blind, and we can't imagine, I've never met somebody that's blind deaf. How do we need to worry about them, and why do we have to worry about all of these people who have other, or colorblind people, and like there's so many different small little groups. But if you look at accessibility and say it's not just those people with permanent disabilities, there's also people who have temporary disabilities. Has anyone here ever been injured? Okay, and what about people who've been in situations where using a computer is a bit awkward and difficult, where they have to sort of juggle a baby or go off and deal with texting while on the bus or emailing while on the bus on to work? I mean, there's definitely a bunch of us that have situations where it's less than ideal. There's a Shopify presentation a little while ago where they went off and did evaluations of people using their products under the influence of alcohol. I'm sure they've also done that under weed at this point, especially since they're selling it. But again, don't assume that your users are working in a dark environment in a professional context where they can give complete and total access and direction to the user. So yeah, this is a great framework. The other thing is dealing with seniors, and baby boomers are a bigger and bigger issue. Politically, they're a big issue. Economically, they're a big issue. Nobody can ignore the baby boomers, and they're all losing their abilities. So let's try to go off and support that. Not support losing their abilities, but support making it easier for them to go off and to use the tools that they've grown used to and need to integrate with the modern world. I hope that the captioning on the bottom isn't annoying. Just want to point that out as well. So Google has a live captioning service that they can stick onto their slides in Chrome, so that you can have some form of live captioning of the event. It's not terrible right now, but yes, it can be a bit distracting. So hopefully that doesn't interrupt, and hopefully it's also useful for those people who are either have hearing problems or just can more easily absorb information in a written form. That's not right. Ah, there we go. Permanent, temporary, situational. I forgot about those animations. So does anyone know who this is? Donna Jodhan, yes. So yeah, she's written on the slide there. So she is the person who is probably most recognized in pushing the government of Canada to be more responsible around accessibility. She sued the government of Canada because the jobs board that she was trying to apply for a job, the jobs board was not accessible to her. And so she took the government to court, and the government of Canada lost the case, and Donna Jodhan won a huge settlement of making sure that forever forward, all government of Canada websites would be completely accessible. And there was a great deal of flurry for a couple of years, and then it's sort of back to usual, because there's other priorities and other things that are important. Yeah, I don't think we need to necessarily go to another landmark case to talk about what was won in that Supreme Court case, but this is something that should already be decided and definitive in the government of Canada. And most websites are pretty good, but there's definitely big problems with a whole lot of other ones. But even if you're looking at one of the challenges of the Donna Jodhan case was it looked at only front-facing websites. So it only cared about you if you were a public citizen engaging with it. That was the focus of this. If you were lucky enough to get a job with the government of Canada, well, that's too bad. You didn't have to have an accessible experience then. Inclusion didn't particularly matter at that point. Well, that's at least how it was interpreted. But there was actually a previous legislation, or not legislation, a previous ruling called the duty, in 2002, there's the policy of duty to accommodate persons with disabilities within the federal public service. So from 2002 onward, there was really no excuse to have accessibility challenges for people within the public sector. Now, I was talking to one guy at the CRA who said that 90% of the software that he is supposed to use, he cannot use with a screen reader. So that's a pretty bad example of how badly we've done for the public sector. And frankly, there's not a lot of people that have looked at the back end side. We've had things like in 2005, we had the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Again, lots of flurry, lots of publications, not a lot of enforcement, and most of it was public-facing stuff, not talking about the back end. There was, back in 2007, we had the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Canada ratified that in 2010. Again, that was something that was a great, it was a great step forward to go off and to have this international convention ratified and be part of that. But how does it boil down to what we do today, and how do we support people with disabilities today? We also saw the movement of other things, like WCAG 2.0 was released in 2008. That was a little while ago. It's being updated to 2.1 as of last year, 2018. And we've also seen the European Accessibility Act and also the Accessible Canada Act both come in this year. So it's interesting to see this movement of legislation around accessibility. And the United States also went off and finally updated their Section 508 to also comply with the international standards, which is the WCAG 2.0 AA. So any questions so far? Okay. This is our current Minister of Procurement, Carla Cointreau, who this is when the Accessible Canada Act was being introduced to Parliament and was being read out. And this is a bill that had universal support across all of the parties. There was some pushback from what changes that the Senate wanted from what the House originally recommended, but essentially there is consensus around supporting people with disabilities in a much more comprehensive way and to bring it into law. So this act addresses not just the government of Canada, but it addresses all crown corporations and all federally regulated agencies as well. So if you work in a bank or you work in an airline, like these are federally regulated agencies. Communications companies, those are federally regulated agencies. And so these guidelines apply to you. And it was also something that was addressing some of the legacy problems that we've had in the in accessibility in government. I mean, it was just actually, first I want to say that there was a real effort to try and make this bigger and broader, but there's only so much in a federal system that you can accomplish. So you can't, you can't just simply say, we will eliminate all barriers to accessibility across Canada, and Canada will be completely accessible. The federal government did have limitations in what it could accomplish and what it could do within this mandate, and they wanted to put something forward that was within their mandate, at least at this first attempt. So there will be an improvement in the built environments. Built environments will need to be more accessible, and that there will need to be greater source of employment for people with disabilities, greater opportunities. In the legislation over the next 5 years, there's going to be 1,000 people hired every year with disabilities to be brought into the public sector. That's a lot of people, especially if there aren't support services for those people who are, once they get into the public service. If you hire a blind person and then tell them 9 out of 10 programs that we use are not accessible, they're not going to have a very effective work environment, and they're probably going to leave soon, right? And that's not the goal. This is going to be a failure if the Government of Canada hires 5,000 people and 4,000 of them leave after a few months in service out of frustration and despair of not having the tools that they need to do the job they were hired for. There's also a huge element around information and communications technology, and again, this is not just the front-facing stuff. In the Accessible Canada Act, we are looking at the back end as well. And procurement tools as well, so trying to go off and adjust the whole procurement process to make sure that that's more accessible, and that the new ICT that is brought into the government is more accessible, and to really promote that. It was Alex Benet went off at a conference at the International Disability Day, December 3rd last year, the year before, said, that as of April 1st, there would be absolutely no software bought by the Government of Canada that wasn't accessible by default. And I was like, okay, the government's going to stop buying software. The government did not stop buying software, and absolutely the software that the government is continuing to buy is not accessible by default. And partly because that's not an achievable thing, but you can't, Drupal's coming closer than anything else, but it's still not 100% accessible all the time. It just doesn't work that way. Just like the Government of Canada doesn't buy software that's 100% secure. Why not? Because you can't. It's not a possibility, right? We need to go off and think about this as a journey, and how are we involved in that journey. So we're also looking at delivering programs and services, trying to go off and make sure that the government is implementing services to Canadians in a way that's accessible, and making sure that there's a high level of accessibility and accessibility awareness for people. And that was supposed to be muted. Also looking at transportation, again, another sector that's quite important. It doesn't particularly affect the Government of Canada. On the other hand, if the Government of Canada decides to go off and use something like Uber to go off and to transport public sector employees around between government offices, well, that may have a big impact because you are, is the Uber app something that's accessible? If the government is procuring these services and supporting government transportation within Uber, you got to make sure that that app is as accessible as it needs to be. So this is Yasmin LaRoche, and she's being tasked with the responsibility of trying to go off and build a strategy and to try and implement the strategy with the Office of Public Service Accessibility, or OPSA, which is not very pronounceable, but it's an interesting acronym. So yeah, the current state of accessibility that the Government of Canada is dealing with is to try and make sure that all within the standard of web accessibility, that is all for front-facing websites. So if it's citizen-facing, that's what the standard of web accessibility applies to. The desired state, what we're hoping within the Accessible Canada Act, is that will be in a situation so that all of government clients and employees and citizens can engage with the ICT, regardless of their ability, whether it's permanent or temporary. So there's a long gap between what we have now with the standard of accessibility and what we want to be able to achieve. there's a few things that are part of the strategy that Yasmin's team has put together. One is there's a need to go off and build a scorecard of how are government departments doing. Where's the metric? Because if we're going to achieve this goal, we need to be able to see how departments are doing. How are we moving along? So there will be a reporting framework and a dashboard to allow people within Treasury Board to understand how close governments are to achieving these outcomes. How close are we to getting to the desired state? Individual departments are going to need to, as well as all the federally regulated agencies and crown corporations, they're going to need to go off and build accessibility plans. How are they going to go off and get from A to B? What is their state of accessibility? How are they keeping track of that? Who's responsible for this information? Is it IT? Is it communications? Is it the people in human resources? So trying to go off and bring those conversations and bring people together to try and build an understanding within each department in order to address this very complicated issue. There's also an element to try and say, well, how do we try and make sure that we get feedback? How do we make sure that there's a structure to go off and hear from the users and the citizens that are using these tools and technologies in order to go off and say, well, are they meeting their needs? Is there a way to collect the accessibility challenges that we're having in the tools that the government is using and where we can learn from them? And finally, how do we try and have you create reports to mark the progress on this, to keep that sense of having measurable progress towards the goal. So this here is a train station in The Hague and Amsterdam, and I was just in Holland, and wow, the transportation system totally kicks ass. Yeah, sorry for those people who are listening to this on YouTube and who are offended by my use of language. So I mention this because I was meeting with people within the government of the Netherlands about what they're doing on accessibility, and what are their plans in trying to go off and achieve the European Accessibility Guidelines, which is EN 301549. I'll repeat that again, EN 301549. Why do they do things like this? This is completely like ridiculous, So anyways, the European Accessibility Act has a lot of really interesting things in it, and the government of Canada is in looking at building their strategy. They're going to go off and say, well, we want to go off and tie our system to a bigger system, a different group of people that are moving and addressing accessibility. So the government of Canada is looking to Europe. Because Europe is further ahead in many ways than the government of Canada is. So the standard that the European Union has adopted is essentially it's more than WCAG because it deals with other devices. But in terms of web and the web interfaces, it's all based on WCAG 2.1. They don't say that. They give you this long, boring, dry document. It's as long as WCAG 2.0, but it has a whole other chunk of other things for like kiosks and other things that I don't really care that much about because it's not my business, not my space. And you probably don't care about it either unless you're building kiosks for museums and dealing with other technology systems that you're engaging with. But it's for the web, it's WCAG 2.1 AA, and that's going to be the new standard that the government is building towards. And so that's was one piece of information that is coming out that's worthwhile to keep in mind, and that will keep updating as well. So I think that when the European Union adopts WCAG 2.2, which will probably happen in the next 2 or 3 years, then the government of Canada will also adopt WCAG 2.2 as the standard because we're following the European Union's lead on this. Again, this is a bit of speculation, but it's something that's worth thinking about in terms of how do we deal with our tools and our technology, and how do we think about this as a journey as opposed to, yes, we're compliant, we're good, we can move on to something else. So getting back to the Accessible Canada Act, There's a few other changes. One it will come into effect for the first time on April 1st. Why April Fools? Just because that's the government of Canada. One of the big changes is the new CIO of the government of Canada, whoever replaces Alex Benet, this will be on his or her desk to see that they are defining the enterprise requirements for digital accessibility. So it'll be interesting to watch who that person is and what they bring to the table about accessibility and how they approach this complex problem. Because a lot of the policies and regulations are still to be formed. The legislation is there. There's some broad stroke definitions that are already in legislation. There's a lot of other stuff that is not really being, that will be policies and regulations and patterns and best practices that are built within the government. So there's a lot of, will still be to be determined. The other thing is that deputy heads are going to be responsible for actually doing the implementation. So the CIO does the high broad strokes of what goals and directions we're going. And then the deputy heads are looking at the implementation and strategic IT management. How do we implement the strategies, and how do we try and address accessibility for both the public sector as well as for citizens at large. So now I come back down to Drupal, and this is a picture of one of the other maintainers, Andrew McPherson in the middle. He's wearing a blue Martian outfit. He's also been the person that's been leading most of the adoption of WCAG 2.1 standards in the government of Canada. So, sorry, in the Drupal community. Sorry, I have to switch communities. So so Andrew has realized that there was a movement for this, and he looked at the WCAG 2.1 specifications and looked at what we had done for Drupal for meeting WCAG 2.0 and said, okay, I will collect and organize as much as I can to identify problems and address them, and to make sure that there's a good write-up about how and why we should go off and implement improvements in Drupal 8 and 9 for WCAG 2.1. And we're going to need to do that when 2.2 gets released as well. So there's right now 38 open accessibility issues in the issue queue, and going back to the Adam's presentation earlier, if you're looking for something to do, there's 30 issues that you can look at to Drupal in Drupal core to contribute to make it easier for your department or agency to go off and implement their website for WCAG 2.1 requirements, because it's something that has already been addressed. It's something that has already been part of the Drupal community. If you fix it in core, if you fix your accessibility problem in core or in a contributed module that you use, then it will be fixed for you, but it'll also be fixed for everyone else. And you're not, I think a lot of people look at contributing back to the Drupal community as that extra thing you have to do. If you go off and to contribute it back, to contribute those patches back. If you fix the problem now, it actually means that it'll be fixed for the long term. So you'll never have to go off and reapply that patch that fixes the accessibility problem if you go off and contribute it back to the Drupal core community. You can test it with other people. It might be that other people are going to go off and look at your patch and say, yeah, this works great for IE and JAWS, perfect. But for those of us using NVDA and VoiceOver, it makes it 10 times worse. So, again, trying to go off and make sure that you think about the community as a way to make sure that you're having the best solution possible and you're building for a best practice. And again, in terms of WCAG 2.1 and other ways to contribute, the Web Experience Toolkit has also not gone off and addressed WCAG 2.1. Again, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that isn't fixed. Same with the Web Experience Tool, the Drupal implementation of the Web Experience Toolkit as well. There hasn't been a review of that to try and improve that great distribution for WCAG 2.1. These are great ways to contribute back and to find ways to address the needs of the government community in large as well as the Drupal community. So if you're looking for ways to make a big impact on inclusion and accessibility, these are great places to start, and things that you should be able to go off and to tie in directly to your jobs and your work environment, because you're going to need to meet these WCAG 2.1 requirements. And yeah, that's the testing. Has anyone heard about Axe Core? Excellent. So AxeCore is it's an open source testing environment that that was put forward by the DQ folks. DQ is a great company that does web accessibility reviews and audits, and they provided this great open source tool that is now being used by Google Lighthouse, by Microsoft's Accessibility Insights, by who else? By a whole stack of other people have taken this accessibility checker engine and found ways to bundle that into a tool that allows people to be able to check for basic accessibility problems and to evaluate that and have a standard that hopefully everyone can start building towards an understanding, so that you can understand why you might have a different result from Wave than you do from Site Improve, as you do from Tenon, as you do from AxeCore. That there's an open standard for accessibility testing engines, and that there's common patterns that are being looked for in all of them in order to go up and to make sure you meet your needs. But I bring up AxeCore because it's a great way for people to test for accessibility and to build in that. And AxeCore is already doing some testing for WCAG 2.1. So if you go off and take the time to go off and to build in testing infrastructure using AxeCore, you're going to be able to go off and catch some automated issues and some challenges around accessibility that AxeCore can already identify with a simple automated tool. And I think it's important to think about how complicated accessibility is, and how you can't simply go off and assume that you need to be able to build in automated testing to catch things, and using a framework that's being updated regularly, and not using some outdated accessibility checking software that isn't being used by the rest of the community, that isn't being well maintained and well organized. AxeCore is a great tool. It's free and open source, and it should be adopted across the government of Canada because it's a great testing framework. So again, that's another space for people to get involved and contribute. I think that's all my issues there. I usually have a slide for kittens, because people think about open source as being free. Free as in beer, free as in speech are sort of common discussions. I think about it as free as in kittens. So how do you find ways, if someone gives you a free kitten and you don't feed it and nurture it and go off and take care of it and take it to the vet on a regular basis, it will find ways to terrorize you and or bring you dead things, and you've got to nurture these animals, and these things that are free are not necessarily without cost. So finding ways to invest in it with your time, your resources, your enthusiasm, even just talking about it. If the government of Canada at some point said, we chose Drupal because it was more accessible than the options, and there is, I'm confident, no other piece of software that is as accessible out of the box than Drupal. At least not that as not just any enterprise level, anything large enough to have a sustainable mass of software. If you're going to invest your IT infrastructure in something that will have staying power and has a community behind it that is able to maintain it over time, there's no better investment than Drupal. And it would be lovely if some level of government were willing to say that and say, yes, we believe in this, we're doing this, we've been doing this for decades because, or not decades, for a decade, because we believe in this, and because this has gotten us results, and it's saved us money, and it's improved our access to users. But there does seem to be some sort of hesitation. It's quite easy for a minister to stand up and say, blah, 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 Microsoft, Twitter, Facebook. But if you go off and if somebody were to speak about Drupal and open source and collaboration, then suddenly it's, ooh, we can't do that. That's showing favoritism. But it's not favoritism if you talk about Google and Facebook and Microsoft, for whichever reason. So this is my pitch for getting involved in the Drupal community around accessibility and using the Accessible Canada Act to go off and to dig in more deeply to what Drupal can do to go off and make your lives easier for both your staff and for your end users. And I can answer questions any questions you might have on accessibility or the Accessible Canada Act if you have them.
Yeah, the question is, your caption tool there understood freezing kittens for a moment, but that's pretty. That's
a bit extreme. A bit extreme.
It changed its mind there. I'd like to hear you talk about what your thoughts are about using API-first initiatives in the context of accessibility, and I'm thinking especially of. As an example, public transit, which decades ago, which their websites to find how to get from point A to point B or what the schedules were basically inaccessible, not just to people with disabilities, but to everyone, which is basically inaccessible. And individually, the agencies that manage these things didn't have the institutional capacity of adding accessibility to those tools, I think. So that was fixed in a way by making like a documented public API, making the data available. And then you have all these apps which can consume this data and make it accessible to different people.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what your is thinking in an API-first manner. Have you witnessed that like improving accessibility? Do you see that as being part of the solution that we can aim towards to making it possible for third parties to then develop tools which are accessible, so we don't have to think about this stuff, or we don't have to have the illusion that we can fix everything in-house?
I love APIs. I think that the government moving towards an API-focused approach is definitely the right direction for a lot of reasons. I think there's also a lot of problems with the JavaScript front-end community and React in particular, well, not React, Angular, like a lot of the fancy JavaScript front ends just neglect HTML. And it's like, oh, we're just going to use area, which is the accessible rich internet applications, to define everything, and we can just keep using our divs and play along like we're just doing bits of objects moving around. We'll forget the semantics of HTML and jump right to area. And that way we don't have to change anything. And that itself is a problem because the first rule of area is don't use area. And if you, it does sort of mirror Fight Club, but it's not actually a Fight Club. It's a W3 spec. But I think that's definitely a challenge. Gatsby is really good because it's building in accessibility frameworks. It's trying to go off and build something that by default is accessible. And if you get something that is a bundle of bolts that is completely inaccessible and you don't have any accessible patterns, and you can make React and Angular and raw JavaScript and Vue accessible, you definitely can. But if it requires the extra effort of the developer to do that, 9 times out of 10 it will be dropped, right? Because most developers don't have the time and they aren't testing it. And it's not just testing it once, it's regularly testing it. It's being able to go off and say, how do you make sure that this framework that you're able to keep up with the framework and keep up with the assistive technology and keep up with the standards. And if you're not part of a community that's working on that, there's no way it becomes unmanageable very quickly. Like there was a point in Drupal 7 when we were addressing a way to go off and use, to address display none. So this is a simple CSS problem. Does everyone know the problem with display none? So for people who aren't as familiar with accessibility, if you use the CSS command display none, screen readers interpret that literally. So that means that if you have some semantic information in there, like a heading or whichever, it doesn't get displayed to the screen reader. So how do you go off and deal with that? And we built a solution for that created a non-visual implementation for Drupal 7. And we built that pattern right into the framework, and the modules and whatnot are using that. But when we defined the release, when we defined the solution and when we released the product, Apple went off and released a new version of VoiceOver. It was Snow Leopard or something, and it went off and broke our fix because of this new release. And well, if you've developed your own solution and you've got this patch in here that works for one version of the software, and you don't go off and test on the latest version of every operating system and browser and assistive technology out there on a regular basis, how are you going to know that it's broken? You're going to have to wait till some error comes up, and you're going to have to dig around and find some solution for it, and it's going to be slightly different for your implementation than anyone else's. And it's probably going to be, this is too complicated, we don't have the time, there's other priorities, it's not going to happen. So being part of a community that has a critical mass of accessibility, people and knowledge and commitment, like the Drupal community and the Gatsby community do, is really important. Sorry. Any other questions before we get kicked out of the room?
Talked about the ATAG conformance with Drupal. Is that part of the issue backlog? You mentioned there's like 30 open issues. Are they related to ATAG stuff, or is the ATAG done?
The WCAG 2.1 issues are, I mean, there's only 30 issues for the WCAG 2.1. There's a lot more issues on accessibility. And I haven't actually checked on how many issues there are for ATAG. There are still a number of other ones that are addressed for ATAG. But it's, ATAG is I do a lot of presentations on ATAG as well. ATAG is really powerful. It's probably the single most effective way to go off and to improve accessibility in an institution's website. Because any large institution that has a lot of authors creating content, you need to, it's a worthwhile investment to help them go off and to be able to create accessible content. We've done little things like just making sure that you need to have alt text on your images. That's a required element. You can disable that because it's open source and realize that in some cases this isn't necessary. But requiring people to put in alt text makes it just that much harder for people to skip it, right? And it's all about sort of changing patterns and supporting authors to do the right thing. And you know, most CMSs out there don't even do any ATAG. And because from Drupal 7 onward, we've essentially treated both the front end and the back end as being accessible. So we did some work for set up a Drupal 8 website with the web form module because the CNIB was looking at surveys, and they're having trouble going off and creating surveys that were both accessible for the front end and the back end. And just using the default tools that Drupal was able to provide with Drupal and the Drupal 8 web form module, they were able to go off and to manage and control their web forms and be able to have a really interactive experience as blind users, both as users, as authors, as administrators, and that's a really powerful thing. And yeah, it would be great if we saw more of an emphasis around ATAG and some more of an understanding around ATAG. But at this point, it's enough of a challenge just to get people to think about WCAG, unfortunately. Yeah.
Your caption tool is thinking about WCAG. It doesn't get
Oh man, that's
WCAG.
bad.
It has some good parts though.
It should be WCAG. Is that better?
Yeah, WCAG 2.1.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of opportunity to go off and make accessibility better, and there's for the first time ever legislation that makes that a higher priority. And regardless of what happens on the election on Monday, do go and vote if you haven't already. Vote early and often. There's going to be more money and more initiatives around this legislation because there was unanimous support for it. So even if there is a conservative government in power, there will be some emphasis around this. Certainly if the Liberals are back in power in a minority or a majority government, there will be, they will want to go up and see this through because they just passed this legislation at the end of June, and it hasn't really had a chance to go off and be implemented, and they want to be able to show success in the next election. So there will be some more momentum around that. All right, excellent.